A man born different, rejected, mocked, in pain for 30 years. A stranger from Lagos who wasn't supposed to stay. A village that voted them out. A surgery on the other side of the world. A kiss in a hospital room that changed everything. And a love so unexpected, not even they saw it coming. This is Fabian and Matthew. And this is the story your village would never tell you. Fabian had known something was wrong since childhood. The birth defect was not visible on the surface, not like a missing limb or a crooked spine that people could point to and name. His condition was private, buried beneath clothing, but its effects touched every corner of his life. He had been born with an abnormally enlarged genital organ, a rare congenital condition that local medicine had no framework for. In the city, doctors might have called it by its clinical name. In Umyub village they simply called it a curse. The pain was real and constant. Long walks caused discomfort. Certain postures were impossible to hold for more than a few minutes. Physical labor left him aching in ways he could never explain to another man without shame swallowing the words whole. By the time he was a teenager he had learned to manage it quietly, adjusting how he sat, how he stood, how he carried himself, so that the suffering remained invisible to everyone around him. Everyone except his mother. Ada was a fierce and tender woman who had noticed everything from the beginning. She rubbed warm shea butter on his joints when the swelling worsened, brewed bitter herbs she claimed would balance the body, and sat beside him on difficult nights without requiring him to explain. She told him nightly that the gods did not make mistakes. Fabian loved her for it. But love could not fix what was structural. The social damage was perhaps worse than the physical pain. He had tried in his younger years to seek companionship. He was handsome enough, broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw and an easy laugh when he felt safe enough to use it. But every attempt at closeness ended the same way. Women his age kept their distance, warned by mothers who understood nothing about his condition except that it was different. And in Umyub, different was dangerous. The young men were no kinder. They made jokes he pretended not to hear. They excluded him from conversations about courtship and marriage, as though his presence at such discussions was an insult to the subject. By the time he was 25 he had stopped trying. He filled his days with farming and carrying water from the stream and watching his childhood friends tie red cloths to the Irako tree with their new brides, their faces glowing with a happiness he had quietly stopped hoping for. He was 31 years old and had never once spoken to a doctor. He had never left Umyub. He had never owned a phone. He had never imagined that the life pressing down on him like a stone could be lifted. That was about to change. Matthew arrived in Umyub on a Tuesday, driving a dusty white Jeep that drew every child in the village to the roadside like a magnet. He was not a craftsman or a trader. He was a public health outreach worker, sent by a Lagos-based NGO to visit rural communities and identify residents with untreated medical conditions. He was 34, lean and composed, with close-cut hair and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years walking into difficult rooms and making people feel safe inside them. He carried a laptop, printed pamphlets, a portable blood pressure monitor, and a calm professional manner that felt entirely foreign in a village where the last visiting doctor had passed through 5 years ago and never returned. He set up a consultation space in the community hall, and for 2 days, mostly elderly villagers filed in with complaints about joints and eyesight and persistent coughs. Fabian watched from across the square, arms folded, telling himself he had no reason to go inside. On the third morning Matthew found him at the borehole. "You've been watching the hall for 2 days," he said, without accusation or amusement. "Simply stating a fact. But you haven't come in." Fabian stiffened. "Nothing is wrong with me." Matthew looked at him, not with pity, not with the scanning suspicious gaze Fabian had grown up receiving, but with the level patience of someone trained to wait. "All right," he said simply. "But if something were wrong, hypothetically, would you even know where to go?" The question lodged itself somewhere deep in Fabian's chest and refused to leave. That evening, as the sun turned the sky amber and the village settled into its nighttime rhythms, Fabian went to the hall. He sat across from Matthew, hands clasped tightly on the table, eyes fixed on the wood grain. He didn't speak for a long time. Matthew didn't rush him. He simply sat, pen resting loosely in his hand, waiting with an ease that suggested he had done this many times before. When Fabian finally began to speak, the words came slowly at first, then faster, the way water moves once a crack appears in a dam. He spoke about the pain. About the condition he had never named aloud to another human being. About the years of isolation and rejection. About the herbalist who had tried and failed. About his mother's herbs and her prayers and how neither had been enough. Matthew listened without flinching. He asked calm, clinical questions. He took careful notes. His expression remained professional throughout, but his eyes held something warmer than professionalism. A genuine, focused attention that made Fabian feel for the first time in his life that his suffering was being taken seriously by someone with the ability to do something about it. When Fabian finished, Matthew closed his notebook and looked at him directly. "What you're describing has a name," he said. "It is a congenital condition. It is not a curse. It is not punishment from any god or ancestor. It is a structural abnormality that you were born with, and it can be corrected through surgery." Fabian stared at him. "There are specialists in India and the UK who handle exactly this type of case," Matthew continued. "I have personally helped 3 other men from communities like yours access treatment through our foundation's medical travel program. You would not be the first. You would not be alone in it." Fabian's throat tightened. He looked down at the table. He was not a man who cried easily. 31 years in Umyub had squeezed that particular softness out of him long ago. But something was shifting in his chest, something large and long immovable, and he had to press his jaw tight to keep his face still. "Why would you help me?" he asked finally. Matthew leaned forward slightly. "Because you deserve it," he said. "That's the whole reason this program exists." Fabian walked home that night through the familiar red dust paths of Umyub, past the Irako tree and the cluster of cooking fires, past his mother's hut where lamplight flickered in the window. The village looked exactly as it always had. But something inside him felt entirely different. Lighter. Fractured open in the way that sometimes precedes healing. He pressed his hand flat against his chest and stood in the dark for a moment, breathing. For the first time in 31 years, he had been told that what he carried was not his fault, and that it did not have to be forever. Matthew extended his stay in Umyub to process the NGO's rural documentation backlog, and over the following 3 weeks he and Fabian fell into an easy, quiet rhythm that neither of them planned and neither of them questioned at first. Mornings, Fabian helped Matthew navigate the village, introducing him to families, translating the older dialect the community elders preferred, vouching for him in spaces where a city stranger might otherwise have been met with suspicion. Evenings they sat outside the community hall as the heat softened and talked. Not always about medicine. Matthew spoke about Lagos, about the sprawling chaos of it, the traffic and the noise and the way the ocean looked from Lekki at night. He spoke about the work, the gap between what rural communities silently suffered and what urban hospitals could fix. He was not preachy about it. He spoke about injustice the same way he spoke about everything, directly, without performance. Fabian found himself listening with his whole body. He also found himself noticing things he had no framework for. The way Matthew's voice dropped slightly when he was saying something he cared about. The way he laughed, sudden, unguarded, like he had momentarily forgotten to be composed. The particular stillness he carried, as though the world's noise simply did not penetrate him. One evening, during a brief, harmless argument about the best route to the eastern farm, Matthew grabbed Fabian's wrist to point his arm in the right direction, and Fabian's entire chest went quiet. He pulled his arm back and said nothing. Matthew continued talking, unaware. That night, alone in his hut, Fabian stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through what he was feeling. He was not naive. He recognized the warmth, the attention, the particular way his mood lifted when Matthew was near. He had never felt it for a woman. Not once in 31 years. He had always quietly wondered about that, filed it away with all the other things about himself that didn't fit neatly into Umyub's expectations. He said nothing. Not yet. He was not sure he had either the words or the safety. But the feeling was there, steady and patient, like a fire that had been lit and was in no hurry to go out. The village, meanwhile, had begun to notice. 2 men spending every evening together, one from the city, one already considered strange, was more than enough fuel. Emeka, a hunter with a sharp tongue and a talent for cruelty, was the first to say it openly. He stopped Fabian at the borehole one morning, a smirk arranged carefully on his face. "City man has made you his woman, Fabian?" he said, loud enough for the surrounding women to hear. "Is that why you no longer greet your age mates? You are too busy following a man like a dog." The surrounding women looked away. A few laughed quietly. Fabian felt the familiar heat of shame start to rise, but something new rose beneath it this time. Something that pushed back. "I have nothing to say to you, Emeka," he said calmly and walked on. He told Matthew about it that evening. Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let them talk. Threatened people are always the loudest." "You're not worried?" Fabian asked. Matthew looked at him steadily. "I'm more worried about you. Does it hurt?" The question was so direct, so genuinely caring that Fabian had to look away. "It used to," he admitted. "Now I'm mostly tired of it." Matthew nodded slowly. Then, quietly, "You deserve a life bigger than this village's opinion of you, Fabian." Fabian looked back at him. In the warm evening light, Matthew's face was open and unhurried, and the words settled over Fabian like something he hadn't known he'd been waiting to hear. "You keep saying that," Fabian said softly. "Because it keeps being true," Matthew replied. The space between them was quiet for a long moment. Then Matthew reached across and briefly squeezed Fabian's hand, a simple, grounding thing, before standing to go inside. Fabian sat alone in the evening air long after he left, his hand warm, the fire in his chest burning steadily. It was a child who started it, as it often is with things that spiral. A young boy who had been playing behind the community hall one evening ran home and told his mother he had seen Fabian and the city man sitting very close, their hands touching. The mother told a neighbor. The neighbor told her husband. By morning, the story had moved through Umyub the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, indiscriminate, and leaving nothing unchanged. What had been quiet suspicion became open accusation. The word appeared first in whispers, then in the market, then finally spoken aloud in the square by Elder Okafor, his voice trembling with something between disgust and religious authority. Abomination. Fabian heard it on his way to the borehole. He heard it again outside the cassava shed. He saw it in the way women pulled their children indoors when he passed, in the way men who had known him his entire life looked at the ground rather than meet his eye. Even people who had never cared much for village politics seemed freshly galvanized, as though the accusation had given them something to agree on. He went to Matthew's accommodation that evening and found him already aware. Someone had thrown a stone against the wall of his room during the afternoon. He had not been hurt, but his face carried a new tension he was working to keep flat. "Are you all right?" Fabian asked. "I've faced worse," Matthew said. Then after a pause, "Have you?" Fabian sat down heavily. "Not like this. The whispers before were about my condition. This feels different. This feels like they want something done about it." Matthew looked at him carefully. "Fabian, before anything else happens, before the elders, before the noise gets louder, I need to ask you something honestly. And I need you to answer honestly." Fabian met his gaze. "Ask. What is this?" Matthew said quietly. "Between us, what is it to you?" The question hung in the air. Outside, the sounds of the village continued, cooking fires, distant laughter, the call of night birds. Inside the small room, everything was still. Fabian had spent 31 years swallowing things. The pain of his condition. The ache of loneliness. The slow grief of being a man the world kept finding reasons to reject. He was extraordinarily tired of swallowing. "I don't fully understand it," he said carefully. "But I know that when I am with you, I am not ashamed of myself. I know that I think about you when you're not there. I know that what I feel for you is the closest thing to peace I have ever felt." He paused. "I don't have a cleaner answer than that." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against Fabian's, a tender, wordless thing. Fabian closed his eyes. Neither of them moved. Then Matthew pulled back slightly, just enough to look at him. "I see you, Fabian," he said softly. "All of you. The strength and the pain and everything the village couldn't figure out what to do with. I see it. And none of it makes me want to leave." Fabian exhaled slowly. Then Matthew's hand came up to the side of his face, gentle, deliberate, and their lips met. Brief, quiet, honest. The kind of kiss that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles into the bones and stays. When they pulled apart, Fabian pressed his eyes shut for a moment. "I have never," he started. "I know," Matthew said. They sat together in the small room while the village outside sharpened its knives, and for a little while, neither of them cared. The elders summoned them both at dawn. The drums that called the village to the square that morning were not festival drums. They were the slow, heavy beat of official business, the kind that demanded attendance and promised consequence. By the time Fabian and Matthew arrived, nearly the entire village had gathered. Children sat on their mothers' laps. Old men leaned on carved staffs. Emeka and his group stood near the front, arms folded, faces arranged in the particular satisfaction of people who believe justice is about to be served. Elder Boniface, the oldest and most senior, wasted no time. "Fabian, son of Anazi," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "You have brought this stranger into our community. You have walked with him, eaten with him, and now it is said you have defiled yourself in this land with an act that our ancestors never permitted. An abomination walks among us. What do you say?" The crowd was silent. Every eye fixed on Fabian. He stood straight. He thought of all the years he had stood in this same village with his head bowed, apologizing for a body he did not choose and a self he did not design. He thought of Matthew's forehead against his. He thought of what it had felt like to finally tell the truth. "I say that I have lived in this village for 31 years, Fabian said, his voice calm and clear. "I carried a condition no one here understood or tried to understand. I lived in pain that none of you asked about. I watched every door close on me while you decided I was cursed, not because I had done anything wrong but because I was born different. Matthew is the first person in my entire life who looked at me and saw a man worth helping. Worth knowing." He paused. Around him the silence was absolute. "What we are to each other, I cannot give you a name for it that will satisfy you. But I know it is not evil. I know it has not harmed a single person in this village. And I know I am done apologizing for it." Elder Okafor rose from his seat. "You stand before your ancestors and defend this abomination? You bring shame to your father's name, to the soil he is buried in." Several people shouted in agreement. A woman near the back cried out that the land would be cursed. Emeka pointed at Matthew and said something sharp and ugly that made the men around him laugh. Fabian's mother Ada stood at the edge of the crowd. Her face was a difficult thing to read, torn between the grief of a mother watching her son be devoured by the community she had raised him in, and something else. Something that looked, if you watched carefully, almost like pride. The elders deliberated in low voices. Then Elder Boniface raised his hand for silence. "The verdict of this council is as follows. Fabian, you may pursue your medical treatment. That is your right as a living person. But this other matter, this abomination, will not be permitted to take root in our soil. If you leave this village with this man as more than a patient, you leave without the blessing of your ancestors. You will not be received as a son of Umyub upon return. The door will be closed." The crowd murmured its approval. Fabian stood still for a moment, the weight of the pronouncement settling over him. Then he turned and found his mother's eyes in the crowd. She looked at him for a long full second. Then she gave the smallest nod. He turned back to the elders. "Then the door is closed," he said quietly. He picked up his bag from beside his feet. He had packed it before dawn. Matthew was already standing at the edge of the square, hands in his pockets, waiting without drama. As Fabian walked toward him, the crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of the instinct to avoid touching something they had declared unclean. He walked through them without dropping his eyes. The surgery took place in Chennai, India, 10 weeks after Fabian left Umyub for the first time in his life. The journey alone was enough to undo a man. The drive to Lagos, the noise and scale of the city, the first airplane ride during which Fabian gripped the armrest and stared at the clouds with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to be terrified or amazed. Matthew sat beside him, narrating calmly, pointing out landmarks below as though they were simply taking a walk. "You're doing it," Matthew said somewhere over the Gulf of Guinea. "I'm not dead yet," Fabian replied. Matthew laughed. Fabian, despite everything, laughed too. The specialist in Chennai was a soft-spoken man who treated the case with complete clinical normalcy, as though correcting congenital conditions was simply the day's work, which for him it was. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Recovery stretched across 12 careful days in a quiet hospital room with pale blue walls and a window that looked out over a courtyard of coconut palms. Fabian spent those 12 days watching Tamil television he couldn't understand, eating rice that tasted nothing like his mother's, and slowly, cautiously, learning what it felt like to exist in a body that no longer caused him daily pain. It was disorienting in the way that all long-awaited things are disorienting. He kept waiting for the familiar ache and finding only quiet. Matthew visited twice during recovery, flying in from Lagos both times. He brought chinchin in a small plastic bag on the first visit, which made Fabian laugh so hard it pulled at his stitches. On the second visit, he brought a printed photograph, the Irako tree in Umyub, taken the morning they left. Fabian held it for a long time without speaking. "Do you miss it?" Matthew asked. "Parts of it," Fabian said honestly. "My mother. The smell of the harmattan. The sound of the drums during festival." He set the photograph down on the bedside table. "Not the rest." Matthew sat in the chair beside the bed. Outside, the courtyard palms moved in a light wind. "What happens next?" Fabian asked. "That depends on what you want," Matthew said carefully. Fabian looked at him. This man who had driven a dusty jeep into a village that had never heard of him, who had sat patiently across a wooden table while a broken stranger found the words, who had absorbed stones thrown at his wall without drama and forehead touched him in a small room while an entire community decided they were an abomination. "I want to say something I should have said before the elders, before the square, before all of it," Fabian said. His voice was steady. "Not because we were about to lose something. but because it is true and I am tired of leaving true things unsaid. Matthew was very still. I love you, Fabian said, simply. Without decoration. I don't fully know what that means for two men or what it will look like or what the world will say about it. But I know it is real. And I know it is the most honest thing I have ever said out loud. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Matthew leaned forward, took Fabian's face in both hands and kissed him, slowly, deliberately, the kind of kiss that is less about the moment and more about everything that led to it. When they parted, Matthew pressed his forehead against Fabian's, the same way he had that first night in the small room while the village sharpened its knives outside. I have loved you since the borehole, Matthew said quietly. When you told me nothing was wrong with you and every single thing about your face said otherwise. Fabian exhaled, the kind of exhale that carries years inside it. He thought of Elder Boniface's voice. Abomination. He thought of the crowd parting like he was something unclean. He thought of Emika's laughter, the women pulling their children away, the stone thrown against Matthew's wall. He thought of his mother's small nod. He thought of what it felt like to walk out of that square without dropping his eyes. Outside, the Chennai courtyard was warm and quiet. The coconut palms moved. Somewhere in a village in southeastern Nigeria, drums were probably playing for a festival Fabian was no longer welcome at. Somewhere an elder was warning a congregation about the abomination that had walked out of Umyub. Somewhere his mother was sitting by the hearth, roasting plantain, her hands rough and her heart full of things she had not said and did not need to. The gods do not make mistakes, she had told him more times than he could count. Fabian held Matthew's hand in a hospital room on the other side of the world, his body no longer in pain, his truth no longer buried, and finally, slowly, completely, he believed her. If Fabian's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is already waiting.